Okay, and I want to talk about basically the pros and cons of the different material techniques, and why some outweigh others, when they should be used in certain situations. Now, the biggest con, I guess, of the copy and paste technique, where we take the terrain function, copy it, and paste it into the material, is that if we want to modify the procedural terrain, we have to modify the material. And it's not always a big deal. But if we take a look at this function, this is a rather large function. We've got a lot going on here. So if we make any changes to the terrain within the terrain editor, we definitely have to copy and paste any of the settings over, or go in manually and manipulate the settings to match. Obviously, it doesn't seem like a lot because you can easily copy and paste and just reconnect a few things. The only problem is the changes you've made to the noises and the different scales in order to create that extra bit of variation. Those will be lost. You don't have to reset them up. So your ability to define a reusable function to create new variations by copying, pasting the terrain and modifying those values will take a while to reset up or to match. Now, if you're using version 6 or 5, you don't really have a choice. You have to copy and paste it in order to get it to work. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use that information. Although relying on the altitude production or the altitude input, it can be really beneficial, but you don't have certain options available in the way of customization and having kind of a universal setup. Now, I talked about before the biggest problem with the using the output or the custom dependency output is that it really is identical to the altitude, and we could just connect to the altitude to get this information. However, if you do want to create universal variation that will work for both the elevation and have a difference for the material to be able to create the dependency output, we use the copy and paste method to modify the contrast in order to smooth out areas and connect that to the bump, because we did want it to be different. But we could still do that within this function for the terrain. It's just a matter of working on the material as we're working on the geometry. So we basically have to double everything we're doing with the two different variations. So it would basically be the equivalent of either copying and pasting this entire function and moving it off to the side, or creating a MetaNode, which would obviously be more condensed and easier to work with. And then having one just as an output where we can modify the contrast. And we could even link. One cool thing you can do is if you want to automatically create that double control. So let's say we have our square filter. And our contrast is set up where we've got 4 and an 8. And we want to have the two different variations, the one of low contrast and the one of high contrast. And I've been using values about half. We could set up a very easy setup for this by using a universal number and adding in, so let's do a connectable constant number So let's say we want to control and have the variation of the contrast. Well, what we can do is type in 8, and then we can add in MetaNode multiply and type in 0.5 or 0.2 or 0.25. Anything to reduce it. So now we're going to have a high contrast of 8 and then the low contrast automatically calculated. So if we were to double up the information, all we would need to do is extract our contrast, connect it to that top level number, take our duplicate, which would create our material output, and connect that to the multiplied value. If you have access to metanodes, it's better to create a metanode, or do this internally and provide two outputs. So in the internal function, where it's pretty basic, we could create an identical output that even calls off of these values, whether we're using the small or the mixed modes. So let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to create our material output version, so our low contrast. So what I'm going to do is just select these nodes, copy and paste. Now this is a problem that we ran into where it is duplicating the sizes because of the way they're published. I'm going to name this, or actually this is the large one, so large, just so that we know which is which. Because we do need to have different parameters to control this. Okay, so now we have, this is going to end up being our material version, and this is going to be our altitude version. So we want that dual control, as I just had before, and I need to unpublish everything first. Because these values are going to end up being connected. We can keep the checkboxes, those are fine. So now we're going to set up that multiply function and add in a bunch of connectable constants for each one we need to control. So connectable constant number, and I'll just go ahead and copy and paste. And what we had is 2 for each, so we'll set those up, copy and paste both of those. So we'll say size, because we did have duplicates, one for the small, one for the large. So the size and the contrast. Now I am using connectable constants because I still want the ability to extract them if I wanted to connect it to something else. The only problem with that is you are going to lose the slider. Connectable constants are not a slider, it's an entered in value. And if you need to know the range, then what you can do is extract that parameter, and then you get the slider and you can see the actual range that you would be working with, but you don't have the ability to extract it. So you kind of have to pick which one you want to do unless you want to create a really, really complex function with lots of different sliders and manually entered in values. So you can pick which one you want to do. Actually, I think I will go ahead and just extract these. So that what we have is top one is the contrast, and the bottom one is the size. And that's the large size, or the large contrast and large size. Then we can go over to the small and extract the contrast and the brightness, which is our size. So we can delete those connectable constants, and we'll just remember that's contrast and size. So now we're going to add in MetaNode, or we can go, actually we're going to use a filter, multiply 0.25. And this value can also be something we could change dynamically to modify everything. Since it's just going to modify the material, we can also go ahead and make sure that this is a connection that can be changed. So we're going to use the same value for all of them. And what I want to do is set up that multiply making sure our size, and actually, because of the way the multiply is going to work, that may not give us a correct output. If we have a value of 0, so we could always just make sure we're using a smaller number, or we could set up obviously a more complex function. Mainly the purpose of this was to control the contrast. So actually, since the contrast is always going to be equal, we'll only connect the contrast to this, and we'll take the size. So brightness is going to be identical, and then our contrast will be connected to the multiply. So we're going to do the same thing on the bottom with the small, and go ahead and take the brightness, make it identical, and the contrast, extract, we'll just make that identical too. And then add in, select the multiply, click that link, add the filter, and then we can connect that multiply to the same constant, and that way we can modify both of them at the same time with that one number. If we switch this over to a connectable constant number, that way we can connect all of these to one connectable constant. So if we have this MetaNode copied over about, say, 20 times, we could extract the multiply and connect it to one constant number. So if we change one, we can change the contrast of all of them, if we want to do that. We don't have to, but it is a nice option. So the blender needs to be set up the same, where we have 1 and 0, or 1 and 2. So let's copy that, paste it over. And then we're going to add in a blender, or a combiner node set to blender. It needs to be identical, making sure we have the right input. So input 1 is the small, and I just want to make sure that's set up correctly. So 1 being connected to small, and then we can clip the ratio and also connect that to our checkbox, and that way that is going to work correctly, or still output the same thing but different contrast levels. Add another blender, or combiner set to blender, and then we have input 0 on the blender and input 1 on that combiner. Connect to that checkbox, clip the ratio, and add in a new output, double output, low contrast. We'll name it. And then we want to publish these parameters. So starting with our large scale size, and then the large contrast, and then the small size, or actually that was the contrast. So we can right click and change that to contrast. And publish this one as the small size. And then we want to publish the multiply. And now we have a much more advanced setup with two outputs. One we can use for the material, and one we can use for the altitude. And what we just need to make sure we do is duplicate everything over as you're building it. So if we have a combiner that's combining these other nodes together, we need to duplicate that, but connect, instead of to our main output, connect to that low contrast material output, because that's now available as an option. So if I add in a connectable constant number and go to connect this, we can see we have the low contrast or just the regular output. So that creates an even more advanced filter that we can output, or we can output those individual values as well. So that adds more customization and more power to the ability to have that custom dependency and not need to have it within the material function. And that does make things render a little bit quicker because you don't have all of these multiple functions running and being processed. Material functions can get very complex and take a long time to render, especially if you're adding that on top. Now, for the most part, since we're duplicating it, it's still kind of like that, but it gives us the ability to manipulate the function and still have those modified values and also modify the terrain without having to update the material, because it'll be automatically updated for that custom dependency. So with a little extra work, there really is no need to copy and paste the function from the altitude production over to the material unless you're using version 5 or 6. But like I said, it does take a little more setup time, and it's something that it is easier to do as you're going and as you're building it. And the more times you create this kind of setup and the more times you do it, it gets better and better, and you find new ways and more improved ways to pull out exactly what it is you want. And it's just really very much dependent on your style and the type of look you're going for. Now, another disadvantage to the custom output is if you decide to basically bake this terrain, that custom output information is lost because there is no longer a function controlling the terrain. So what we can do is increase our resolution to take a look at how it would show up as a standard terrain, whether or not we would get enough detail from that, just by multiplying the size, of course, 4096 by 4096 being the max output for a standard terrain. So if we were to convert this to a standard terrain up at the top, we're going to lose all our connections to this altitude reduction. Although there is a pretty easy way to save it. One thing we could do is just copy and paste the terrain. Use one that doesn't render. We can hide it from the render and just use it to output the material. And have that material assigned to the standard terrain. That's pretty easy. It does take up more system resources, and for every terrain that you have, you're going to need to have a duplicate. What you can also do is in the graph, so if we edit the object graph, we could paste that function in the object graph and have the outputs be part of the graph instead of the altitude reduction. That way we could output these values as the custom dependencies and bring those over. So there is always a way to kind of make up for any of the disadvantages. It's just how much time you need to spend doing that. And sometimes it's really just going to be dependent on the size of the scene and how complex you want it, because you can just, obviously copying and pasting was very quick in order to get a pretty good look. The only problem is now we need more variation, and we're going to have to rebuild an entire material function. So it's really kind of give and take. But there typically is a way, always a way to get around it. It just takes a little more time. So knowing how to start with your workflow and how to build things up sometimes at the same time can be helpful. Another advantage to the copy and paste method is that you can modify the origin without an entirely duplicate function existing within a graph or within the altitude. That's not really going to be possible. I also want to show you some really important baking techniques. This setup right now is not going to work for animation, at least with the light slope material, the lights material that is restricted by slope. I mean, you're going to really have to crank up your anti-aliasing and texture anti-aliasing in order to be able to get something that isn't going to flicker to death and completely kill everything. Even some of the finer details within the terrain are going to be problematic because from far away there just may not be enough detail. And if we edit the object and increase the quality boost, which I'll show you how to do, and under the procedural tab we do have a quality boost, so we can increase that amount up to 4. I think you might be able to go over and really increase the subdivisions. Not always necessary, but it can help improve the overall quality of the terrain. I also want to go ahead, I'm leaving this at a procedural for the moment, so I'm going to reduce the pixel resolution so that I don't need to load the OpenGL every single time that I want to open and edit this. So if I set the quality boost to 8, we go back, reopen, it is set back to 4. So 4 is going to be the max. That is directly connected to, in the renders, the advanced effects quality. Those are tied together. So whether you need to go to the user settings or you need to start switching to different render qualities to increase that value, it will increase the quality of the terrain. Also, if you need to increase the quality of the terrain, you can go into the material, and under the bumps, you can turn on displacement mapping. Displacement mapping is also going to extrude our function, which right now is really complex, and I would not use for a displacement map, especially on a procedural terrain. I think it's going to take way too long to process, way too much memory, and it's certainly not going to work for animation. Although if we converted this to a standard terrain with this function still as part of the bump and turn on displacement mapping, we can then increase the quality of the standard terrain beyond that preset value of 4096, 4096 being the current max for the square terrain. So at the moment, render time on this has significantly increased because of the material function. So first let's take a look at the material bake, and really it ends up being the exact same thing. We can use the same technique for both the altitude and the material, but you do want to have a good sense of the scale of your scene. It's something you kind of want to do after your terrains and shapes are set up. So really, I mean, you worry about the material after you have all your geometry. I kind of skipped ahead in order to show some of the problems and reduce some of the time it takes to build everything up. There's more modeling or procedural terrain techniques I want to show. We'll take a look at those a little later. Mostly for the randomization, but I think it's really important now to take a look at our options for what we have as an end result, because it can completely modify your workflow in the process of building your scene. Even though in this little part here didn't really show much of the overall techniques, but I did feel it was important to really explain the benefits and disadvantages of certain setups, and hopefully that MetaNode that was designed will be useful for you to be able to create a single function to control everything if you're planning on keeping everything procedural. Like I said, it really depends on the size of the scene and how close you are to the objects, how much detail you need. And breaking it down is obviously a choice where you can set up different qualities and level of detail zones throughout the scene, depending on your total output and what you have in mind. In the next section, we're going to take a look at some baking techniques.